Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the remarkable history contained in the book. Nat Turner, Black Prophet. A Visionary History by Anthony E. Kaye and Gregory P. Downs. We thank you so much for listening, and please do consider subscribing for future content.
And before we get started, we want to be absolutely clear that the voices you are hearing, they do come from AI. But the content, all of the research and the history comes straight from the comprehensive work within this book. We really feel this is a great way to learn about African American history, especially, when your schedule is tight and you need that essential context quickly.
That said, we strongly encourage you to go out and purchase this book. Supporting the authors who dedicated so much painstaking work to documenting this essential part of history is, well, it's incredibly important.
It really is.
So, our mission today is to unpack the story of Nat Turner, and we're going to be focusing intently on that intersection of faith and militancy.
Right. We're exploring how the language of religious prophecy, that burning evangelical conviction, how that combined with a long-established history of Black military resistance.
And that combination shaped everything, didn't it? The structure, the timing, even the terrifying execution of the 1831 revolt in Southampton County, Virginia.
Exactly. We're going to look at Nat not simply as a desperate rebel driven by a hatred of bondage.
Which he was, of course.
Of course. But more than that, as a warrior and a prophet who was operating within a very specific and, frankly, a very volatile religious and historical context.
So to understand the revolt, we really have to start with the ground he walked on. Let's set the scene.
Okay, so we're in what was known as Southside Virginia in 1831. Geographically, this is the region south of the James River, sort of nestled between the flat coastal tidewater area and the Appalachian foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
And this is so crucial, because this was not the world of those, vast, sprawling tobacco or cotton empires that we often picture when we think of the antebellum South.
Not at all. The geography here, it tells a completely different story about labor, and because of that, about resistance.
How so?
Well, the geography really defined the labor system. The land was swampish, it was low-lying, relatively rugged. I mean, we're talking about a place where 4/5 of the county was still just dense woodlands and cypress swamps cut through by rivers like the Nottoway.
Which would make large-scale farming really difficult.
Incredibly difficult. And it also, it complicated efforts by the white patrols to hunt down people who were attempting to escape. It was good land to hide in.
So instead of these immense plantations, you had smaller clusters of enslaved people.
Exactly. Handfuls, maybe dozens, working on orchards, raising hogs, cultivating food crops like corn and wheat. The scale of intimacy between the enslaver and the enslaved, and therefore the tension, it was just different.
Right, and you see that in the population numbers.
You do. Back in 1755, Southampton County had about 4,000 white residents and maybe 2,000 enslaved Black people. By 1830, that ratio had shifted significantly, but the farming structure, it was still very localized.
And the county seat, established in 1791, was a small, dusty town called Jerusalem.
And for a man like Nat, who saw the world through the lens of the Bible, through typology, that name was profoundly symbolic.
It becomes the literal goal.
It becomes the geographical objective of his entire campaign. The American Jerusalem, where he believed he could establish God's new order on earth.
And this environment, this sort of a less structured, newer settlement, it was also a breeding ground for new religious movements, wasn't it?
A perfect breeding ground. By the early 19th century, a lot of the white settlers were shedding their old Anglican ties for the emotionalism of the Methodist and Baptist churches. This was the heart of the Second Great Awakening.
Which brings us directly to Nat's own spiritual upbringing. He was raised within Methodism, a massively dynamic movement that really embraced these intense emotional experiences.
And critically, in its early phase, it often fostered biracial churches. Places like Turner's Meeting House, which is where Nat worshipped.
These places must have been remarkable.
They were. They were known for blurring the color lines, at least during worship. During prayer meetings, sermons, these intense moments of hymnody and singing, there was a sense of spiritual equality.
God's grace transcending earthly categories like race and bondage.
Yes. And that sense of shared, immediate access to the divine created this immense underlying tension with the legal reality of slavery.
And that's the profound paradox the book highlights, isn't it? The white Turner family, who were instrumental in leading Nat to Christ, who attended services right alongside him.
They were at the exact same time expanding their ownership of enslaved people.
Unbelievable.
Benjamin Turner Jr., who owned Nat, expanded his holdings to 30 enslaved individuals, many of whom, by the way, attended that very same meeting house.
So the people guiding Nat to a theology of spiritual freedom were the same people enforcing his physical bondage.
That is an explosive internal contradiction for any devoted believer to live with. It's almost impossible to imagine.
How did Nat, or really any Black person of faith at that time, even begin to try to reconcile that chasm, that huge gap between the promise of heaven and the reality of their lives?
They turned fully into the most intense aspects of their faith. They started viewing themselves as God's chosen people, set apart for a divine purpose.
Yeah.
And to really get that, we have to define two critical concepts from the book.
Okay.
First, the word enthusiasm. Now, today we use that word positively, right? You have enthusiasm for a project.
Sure.
But in the 19th century, especially among the elites, it was a term of denunciation.
It was almost a political slur, wasn't it? It was
Yeah.
used to discredit people who claimed to have dangerous, immediate revelations from God.
Exactly. People who claimed God spoke directly to them, circumventing established authority. And Methodism, with its spontaneous singing, its emotional outbursts, these intense, charismatic experiences, it was frequently accused of generating this kind of socially destabilizing enthusiasm.
So Nat was operating in a tradition where these intense personal experiences with the divine were not just accepted, but expected, even if those same experiences terrified the white establishment.
Precisely. And the second key concept, which is a bit more complex, is typology.
This feels essential to understanding why he acted when he did. Can you break that down for us?
So typology is the belief that God established these divine types. You can think of them as patterns or models in the Hebrew Bible. And these types are then intentionally repeated, fulfilled, or expanded upon later in history.
Okay, so give us an example.
A classic one is the Exodus from Egypt. That's a type that prefigures the ultimate liberation of God's people through Christ. Or the prophet Jonah surviving inside the whale is a type for Christ's resurrection.
I see. So if Jesus fulfilled the type of Jonah or Moses, Nat might believe that he himself was being called to fulfill the type of a military prophet, someone like Joshua who led the Israelites in conquest.
That is the core insight. You've got it. If you just view Joshua as a role model, you might try to emulate his piety. But if you believe God has ordained you to fulfill the type of Joshua, well, then you are destined to carry out religious warfare.
An apocalyptic campaign.
An apocalyptic campaign that doesn't just copy the past, but expands on it to change history and bring about the New Jerusalem. These types, when you apply them to the present, they become revolutionary mandates. They threaten the complete destruction of the enemies of God's kingdom.
That is an immense pressure to put on a young man. And that sense of religious destiny, it must have clashed violently with the realities of his family life under slavery.
It did. Nat's family history was just steeped in resistance and disappointment. His father, Abraham, either successfully ran away or was sold around 1811. And Nat's family, they campaigned through intense faith, believing that God would intervene to ensure his manumission, his freedom, especially as he approached 21.
But those hopes were crushed.
Absolutely crushed. Around 1807, his owner, Benjamin Turner Jr., bequeathed Nat to his son, Samuel Turner. The message was just unmistakable. Despite his extraordinary spiritual gifts, Nat's future was one of forced labor under a new master.
So how did he respond to that?
He responded by withdrawing completely into himself. He embraced an extreme asceticism, fasting and praying, keeping his thoughts intensely private to protect his reputation for having these God-given gifts.
He said something about that later, didn't he?
He did. He later recalled that all his time not devoted to his master's service, quote, was spent either in prayer or making experiments.
Experiments? What kind of experiments are we talking about here?
The book suggests these were spiritual tests, intense periods of meditation, fasting, reading the Bible over and over, seeking direct confirmation of his divine calling.
And this deep austerity, this self-denial, it actually preserved his reputation among both Black and white people.
It did. He was seen as a genuinely devout and remarkable individual, even while he was secretly wrestling with these radical commands from the Spirit. He needed that external reputation for piety to conceal the inner storm of prophecy that was brewing inside him.
That transition from being an ascetic seeker to a confirmed warrior prophet, it involved an excruciating 9-year wait for the command to act. That level of prolonged spiritual anxiety must have been almost unbearable.
I can't imagine. Around late 1821, Nat had his first definitive revelation. He heard a voice repeating a line from Scripture. "Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you."
And for him, this wasn't just general comfort.
Not at all. This confirmed his ordination for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty. But the nature of that purpose, what he was supposed to do, that was still veiled.
And then silence. The agonizing period of testing followed, where he waits 9 years for the final specific command. We see this pattern in other prophetic figures of the era, don't we?
Absolutely. Think of Joseph Smith, who claimed his first vision in 1820, but then waited years before founding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Or Zilpha Elah.
Yes, Zilpha Elah, an African-American female itinerant preacher. She experienced years of doubt, believing God had forgotten her or was punishing her for spiritual pride before she finally received confirmation of her ministry.
That's fascinating. So Nat's wait wasn't unique. It was a recognized feature of the evangelical prophetic experience. What did that delay mean theologically?
Early evangelicals understood this waiting as a holy act. It was a necessary test of faith. The preacher John Morant described it as God often hiding the sensible signs of his favor, and leaves them in such inextricable windings that they know not what course to steer.
So the delay could be a form of punishment or purification.
Exactly, a chastisement for past doubts, forcing the prophet to purify himself completely before receiving the mandate for monumental action. Nat had to endure that purification before he could take up the sword.
And the vision he had in 1825 was where the direction of his mission became unambiguously violent.
Oh, absolutely. He saw a vision of the Holy Ghost in Christ, and in that vision he witnessed, quote, "white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the blood flowed in torrents." This was the definitive signal that his divine commission involved deadly conflict.
And the celestial conflict, it was confirmed and mirrored by signs on the earth.
Yes, he saw drops of blood on the corn in the fields. And even more strikingly, he saw hieroglyphic characters, figures of men that seemed to be drawn in blood on the leaves of the trees.
That detail about the hieroglyphic characters is so powerful, especially since it later became a point of contention.
It did. Thomas Gray, the lawyer who later took Nat's confession, he suspected Nat might have planted those leaves as some kind of con, trying to manufacture a sign.
But that wasn't the case.
Contemporary testimony confirms Nat spoke of these visions years before the revolt, years before his capture, which validates that they were genuine parts of his spiritual experience. The visions were internal and external, celestial and terrestrial.
And the apocalyptic element here is key. This wasn't some unique theological interpretation he came up with. It was deeply embedded in the culture of the Second Great Awakening.
Exactly. Methodists of that era were completely absorbed with the imagery of the Book of Revelation. They sang hymns featuring the sun turning black, the moon turning to blood, blood-dipped robes, all the images of God's final judgment and reckoning.
So Nat's visions were entirely comprehensible within this established, highly militant evangelical tradition.
He wasn't inventing a new theology, he was just applying an existing one to the political reality of slavery.
And the ultimate command to act, that came from an astronomical sign. The Spirit told him to conceal his task until a sign appeared. What was that sign?
The Great Annular Solar Eclipse of February 1831.
Right. An annular eclipse is when the moon covers the sun's center, leaving that bright ring or annulus visible.
And this specific event had been predicted in almanacs, and it caused massive anxiety across Virginia. People were genuinely afraid, with some claiming the world is to be destroyed tomorrow.
So Nat was not alone in seeing this as a cosmic event with prophetic implications. For him, this eclipse was the celestial command to break the seal of concealment and begin the work of death.
And this is a direct parallel to the Book of Revelation, where the breaking of the 7 seals unleashes the end-time afflictions. War, death, famine, and the literal darkening of the sun and the bloodied moon.
So the astronomical event confirmed that his upcoming earthly battle had cosmic significance. This was it. This was the final war between the spirits he'd seen in his vision.
It makes sense, then, that the language of spiritual conflict was so immediately translated into military action. I mean, the very hymns Nat grew up singing, like "Soldiers of Christ, Arise," they compared the process of conversion to being wounded or slain in battle.
And this is where Black Methodism diverges so powerfully from White Methodism, isn't it?
It's a critical split. White Methodists might have applied that language metaphorically, a war against sin, or maybe they reflected on the wars against Britain. But Black Methodists took that pervasive, militant religious language and connected it directly to the wars they must fight for their own freedom.
And we see this militancy articulated by other Black prophets and intellectuals of the time.
Absolutely. You just have to look at David Walker's appeal of 1829. He repeatedly warned slaveholders of God's inevitable vengeance and invoked God as the God of justice and of armies.
He had that quote, "Stop thinking and start acting."
He did. Walker wrote, "Remember, Christians, Negroes, or whatever else you are called, to stop thinking and start acting." Nat's spiritual journey was a literal march toward becoming a general in God's army, armed with prophetic authority, and he was finally ready to act.
This framing brings us to our next section, and it's a critical one. Why the authors insist that we must view Nat's uprising as an act of war, rather than just a crime driven by hatred or despair.
The distinction is absolutely vital for historical analysis. If we treat it as a crime, we only focus on the motive.
Right. They hated slavery, which is obvious.
It's obvious. But if we treat it as an act of war, then we have to analyze Nat's strategies, his tactics, the timing of his campaign, and the military precedents that informed his decisions.
And even officials at the time saw it that way.
They did. Virginia's own governor, John Floyd, described the event in 1831 as such a warfare. He knew what he was seeing.
And Nat wasn't acting in some kind of historical vacuum. He was born into a region that was saturated with the memory of successful Black military campaigns against enslavers.
The memory of two major conflicts was still incredibly fresh: the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812.
Right. During both, the British had offered freedom to enslaved Black people who would fight for them.
Exactly. Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which led to the formation of the Ethiopian Regiment during the Revolution, was a deeply known historical fact in Southampton County.
So what we learn from this history is that enslaved people in the South Side understood that freedom had twice been offered by a foreign power in exchange for military service against their local masters.
It established a profound historical tradition of military action as a viable path to liberation.
And this continuity of resistance is perfectly embodied by the figure of Moses Wilkinson. This is a critical precedent we need to elaborate on.
Wilkinson was an enslaved Methodist preacher in Nansemond County, right next door to Southampton, who fled to the British lines in 1776, taking his whole congregation with him.
He became a type himself.
He absolutely did. He was immediately seen as reenacting the biblical Moses, leading his followers across water, in this case, the Chesapeake Bay, to freedom. And although he later suffered from smallpox, which left him blind and lame, his spiritual authority remained absolute.
He didn't just escape, he became a military and religious leader in the Black Loyalist community that eventually settled in Nova Scotia.
That's right. When the American Revolution ended, the British evacuated thousands of formerly enslaved people. Wilkinson led the Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia, sustaining them through immense hardship by constantly offering a vision of the Exodus story and promising a new promised land.
And when conditions in Nova Scotia proved too harsh, poor land, continued racial prejudice, Wilkinson supported the migration plan to Sierra Leone in the 1790s.
Which, again, wasn't just a physical move. It was seen as fulfilling the long-term spiritual goal of finding the new Canaan.
And the militant element didn't stop there, did it?
Not at all. In Sierra Leone, these former Southside Methodists and Loyalists resisted white control intensely. Wilkinson's congregation was described as a firm body of malcontents who openly chafed against the white company administrators. They even led rebellions against the Sierra Leone Company in 1797 and again in 1800, fighting for self-governance.
So for Nat, in 1831, the tradition was crystal clear. The path of the Black prophet was intrinsically linked to militant action and the establishment of an independent community free from white control, tracing a line directly back to Wilkinson in 1776.
And that line also runs right through Gabriel's rebellion in 1800 in Richmond. Gabriel's plan was steeped in biblical rhetoric. His brother Martin invoked Leviticus to promise victory. 5 of you shall conquer 100.
And he had a clear political plan, too.
A very clear plan. He strategically planned to spare certain white groups, Quakers, Methodists, and Frenchmen, which suggests a politically and theologically informed battle plan, not just random violence.
We also have to remember the seismic impact of the Haitian Revolution, which concluded with independence in 1804.
The Haitian Revolution provided the undeniable and to whites horrifying model of a successful Black uprising. while white Americans tried to spin Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines into figures of pure, savage terror.
Black communities inverted that narrative.
They completely inverted it. They saw them as international icons of successful black generalship and liberation. And it's no coincidence that Nat's own revolt began near a key anniversary of the Haitian uprising, demonstrating that this successful model was actively circulating and inspiring action.
All of these precedents, Wilkinson, Gabriel, Haiti, they lead directly to the most difficult part of analyzing Nat's strategy, the terrible concept of harem warfare.
This is where Nat's literal reading of the Hebrew Bible's military conquest mandates becomes absolutely critical. We have to explain harem clearly.
Please do.
It is the biblical concept of utterly destroying the enemy. It's often translated as the ban, and it means taking no spoils and sparing no one, killing men, women, and children.
Why was this specific model so compelling to Nat and his followers?
They were drawn to the models of conquest found in the books of Moses and Joshua. In Joshua's campaigns, the aim was not simply to conquer the land of Canaan. The aim was to exterminate the 7 peoples inhabiting it, the Canaanites, to make the land completely pure for the new covenant people Israel.
And this specific terrible mandate, it explains the indiscriminate killing that occurred during the revolt, including the women and children on the plantations.
Yeah.
It wasn't just random rage.
Precisely. Nat's band viewed this as fulfilling a holy obligation, the harem ban, which was necessary to clear the land of the moral taint of slavery and oppression so they could establish the New Jerusalem. The killing was a theological act, not just an emotional one.
And we see this thinking reflected elsewhere, too.
We do. In the 1823 Demerara Rebellion, enslaved people studied and read the Book of Joshua. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey's followers in Charleston heard him describe the Israelites' destruction of everyone in Jericho. This was a recognized, albeit terrifying, theological justification for revolution.
It is a sobering reflection that the same religious text that provided so much hope and spiritual strength could also provide a mandate for such horrifying violence.
It speaks to the utter radicalism of the spiritual desperation they faced. When earthly law offered no hope of freedom, only celestial sovereignty remained. And that celestial sovereignty, as depicted in the apocalyptic scriptures, often required a violent cleansing before salvation could arrive.
Let's move to the practical implementation of Nat's war plan in August of 1831. The initial strategy was quite symbolic. It was to align the revolt with American hypocrisy by choosing the 4th of July.
Yes, the initial target date was July 4th. That timing would have just highlighted the glaring contradiction between the white celebration of liberty and the continuing enslavement of black people.
But he postponed it.
He did. He fell sick, and he admitted that the intense psychological pressure of planning such a revolutionary act had affected his mind. The plan was postponed.
And the final, confirming sign arrived in August of 1831.
Yes, likely atmospheric disturbances or sunspots, which he interpreted as the definitive go-ahead from God.
So on Sunday, August 24th, the core group gathered.
They gathered for a dinner near Cabin Pond. This initial group included Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam. The strategy was set, commence at home, and, quote, until we had armed and equipped ourselves, neither age nor sex was to be spared.
A policy, he said, was invariably adhered to.
It confirmed the direct application of the harem mandate.
The rebellion began where Nat lived, at the Joseph Travis farm. And the details of that first attack are morbidly specific and incredibly symbolic.
They are. Nat, who was armed with a hatchet, struck first at his current owner, Joseph Travis, but he missed. And then the man who was designated as the executioner, a man named Will, stepped in with an axe and delivered the killing blow to Travis, and then to his wife, Sally.
It's striking that of the 55 white people killed during the entire campaign, Nat himself only killed one person.
This is very telling. Nat commanded the Holy War. He was the prophet and the general, but he delegated the physical slaughter, the harem, to others, particularly Will.
Why do the authors think that was?
They suggest it might be because of his years of intimate contact with the victims. He had lived with Sally Travis and her children for years. Others, who didn't have that connection, were designated to carry out the cleansing.
And the targets were deeply symbolic. They included his former mistress, Elizabeth Turner, and relatives of the Francis family who were connected to his former owner.
The violence was personal, yes, though it was enacted through a theological mandate.
And the acts were intended to be visceral political statements.
Absolutely. The murder of the infant at the Travis farm and its subsequent mutilation, its beheaded body was placed in the fireplace. that was intended to show that, in the eyes of God and the rebels, slaveholding was a capital crime, deserving of the most severe divine punishment.
Nat's ultimate military objective was clear: Jerusalem.
Yes,
Ah.
for a dual purpose, spiritual and military.
Spiritually, it's the New Jerusalem, the promised land he's destined to establish.
And militarily, it's the county seat, the key political center, and most importantly, the location of the militia's arsenal. To seize that arsenal would mean arming his growing company and escalating the conflict dramatically.
As the company grew, the march required them to split into 2 detachments to cover ground faster, which suggests a surprisingly organized, if fluid, command structure.
It does. They cover 3 miles before reaching the Levi Waller plantation.
And this is where we see a momentary introduction of a concept that seems to deviate from the strict harem mandate.
Yes, the idea of a saving remnant. Davy, an enslaved man who joined at Waller's, later testified that Nat spared some poor white people.
Why? What was the reasoning?
Nat reportedly said he would not kill very poor people because, quote, they thought no better of themselves than they did of the Negroes.
That's a fascinating shift. It suggests he might have been developing a political theology that reserved the ban only for the defined enemies of God's kingdom.
Right. The active slaveholding class and their families. He perhaps saw poor whites as potential allies, or at least people outside the scope of God's wrath. It's a complex moment of possible ideological shift within the campaign.
However, the mission very quickly stalled at James W. Parker's gate. They had reached the critical point, almost within sight of Jerusalem, but the element of surprise was gone.
It was gone. They were confronted by quickly assembled white militias, companies led by men like Captain Alexander Pete, who were already aware and armed. What began as a lightning strike turned into a pitched battle.
And Nat realized the battle was shifting against him.
He did. He assessed the changing conditions, noting they were outnumbered and outgunned as more white men arrived. Key figures were wounded, including Hark, whose horse was shot. Nat's force was driven back, scattering into the fields and woods.
The white militia didn't pursue immediately, but the momentum was lost.
It was. They opted to fortify Jerusalem, but Nat recognized that the initial momentum of his prophetic war was gone. The revolt, as a concerted military effort, had effectively broken.
So Nat fled into the low-lying terrain, the woods and swamps, which were good for hiding, but impossible for waging a prolonged guerrilla war.
Right. This wasn't Jamaica or Haiti. He sent word for his original collaborators to gather back at Cabin Pond, where they had begun, perhaps hoping the prophetic destiny could be reset. But the strategic window had closed, and the campaign shifted entirely from offense to survival.
Once Nat fled, the white response became a systematic, brutal campaign of terror that fundamentally restructured the power relations in the South Side.
The white response was dual. You had extrajudicial violence, and you had judicial prosecution. Militias and volunteers launched a campaign of indiscriminate slaughter, killing between 25 and 40 enslaved black people without even the pretense of a trial.
And the source material is unsparing in describing this violence. It was deliberate. It was intended to demonstrate white power and ownership, asserting who commanded obedience on that ground.
The physical horrors were calculated. We know of the decapitations and the display of heads spiked on a post at the intersection of Barrow Road and Jerusalem Highway.
A location that became infamous for decades as Blackhead Signpost.
These were not simply acts of vengeance, they were macabre warnings designed to restructure the political calculations of every single person enslaved in Virginia.
It's important to note the response of the elite white establishment to this chaos, though. They tried to rein in the militias. Why did they do that?
Well, largely to protect their own investment and to maintain the appearance of a civilized, law-bound society. High-ranking state leaders and elite local whites worked quickly to funnel the punishment through the legal system, the courts of Oyer and Terminer.
To maintain property values.
And to ensure that the terror was administered selectively and legally, rather than chaotically destroying valuable labor. They needed peace, even a false one, after that state of exception.
Nat himself remained in hiding for months. Where did he conceal himself?
He was first in the woods, then, near the Travis farm where the revolt began, he dug a small hole under a pile of fence rails. He referred to it as his cave. And he spent those months marking the days on a stick, a desperate prophet watching time tick by, perhaps waiting for yet another sign.
His time ended on October 30, 1831, when he was captured by Benjamin Phipps. And immediately he began speaking.
He did. He was immediately very free in his confessions, speaking for over an hour about his plans, his revelations, and his unwavering prophetic certainty. There was no immediate sign of doubt or repentance upon his capture.
Which brings us to the complicated figure of Thomas R. Gray, the local lawyer.
Gray was appointed as Nat's court attorney, and crucially, Gray was debt-ridden and saw an immediate commercial opportunity in Nat's story. He wrote down and read Nat's account during the trial, and that became the infamous pamphlet, The Confessions of Nat Turner.
Which means the only record we have of Nat's direct words is filtered and mediated through a man who is seeking to profit from his execution.
Exactly, and you can see how Gray's commercial interests shaped the confessions. He focused intently on Nat's prophetic certainty, almost exaggerating it, because it made the story more sensational and easier to sell. He minimized Nat's earlier doubts.
And more politically, Nat, perhaps strategically, insisted the plan was his alone, guided by revelation.
Right, and he explicitly denied it was part of an extensive or concerted plan.
Why would he do that? Why deny a broader conspiracy?
It was likely a tactical move to protect other potential conspirators and to prevent further white panic, which would have only escalated the retaliatory violence against the enslaved community. By claiming divine solitary leadership, Nat limited the scope of the legal response.
At his trial on November 5, 1831, Nat pleaded not guilty.
He did, arguing that he had been led by the Spirit. He was sentenced to be hanged 6 days later on November 11th.
And the humiliation and desecration of his body following the execution was the final gruesome chapter in that campaign of terror.
Horrific. Nat's body was reportedly skinned, used for macabre souvenirs, and his skull was taken for medical study, circulating through medical colleges as an object lesson.
A calculated effort to rob the prophet's body of any power or spiritual significance, a desperate final assertion of white supremacy over the rebellion and its religious roots.
But the violence failed to silence the political and social legacy. Nat's revolt profoundly changed the South's political landscape, creating immense, devastating consequences for generations.
How so?
Well, the revolt immediately fueled pro-slavery arguments, especially the ideology of paternalism. Slaveholders suddenly started claiming they were morally superior caregivers who protected their people from outside agitation. This was a direct ideological response to the terror of 1831.
And legislatively, the impact was immediate and crippling.
Yes, Virginia and subsequently other states passed laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read or write and severely limited Black religious meetings. These laws directly attacked what the white political class perceived to be the social conditions that had enabled Nat Turner, his literacy, his access to scripture, and the independent power of Black religious organization.
But the most consequential political reaction was the fierce debate in the Virginia legislature in 1831-1832 over gradual emancipation and deportation.
This was a genuine moment of crisis. Political leaders, including Governor Floyd and Thomas Jefferson Randolph, pushed hard for colonization gradual abolition combined with the deportation of Black people as the only long-term path to prevent further violence. They argued that slavery itself was just too dangerous to maintain.
What ultimately defeated that effort?
The immense economic commitment to slavery. The proposal failed by a narrow margin because the legislature was dominated by the interests of plantation owners, who simply could not envision the state's economy without enslaved labor.
And that legislative failure was pivotal.
It cemented Virginia's commitment to slavery right up until the Civil War and marked the end of any serious political discussion about abolition in the Upper South.
Yet, as the book shows, Nat's spiritual legacy persisted, moving outside of that political sphere.
It absolutely did. 30 years later, during the Civil War, enslaved people interpreted the conflict as an apocalyptic holy war that was tied directly to Nat's struggle. Black Union soldiers would sing the spiritual in that New Jerusalem, viewing their military fight for liberty as the fulfillment of Nat's earlier prophecy.
The words of that spiritual really captured the militant faith, didn't they? We must fight for liberty. I am not afraid to die.
Nat's dream of the New Jerusalem was finally, in their eyes, being realized through the Union Army.
So Nat Turner stands as this figure whose unique blending of militaristic evangelical Christianity and revolutionary action forced America to confront the sheer brutality of its institution of slavery. He sought hope when there was none, looking to celestial sovereignty when earthly powers offered only perpetual bondage.
In this exploration, it raises an important question for you, the learner, to consider as you reflect on this history. We noted that Thomas Gray, the man who recorded Nat's words, the man who sought to profit from his execution, He was initially a religious scoffer, but he later supposedly confessed his own sins on his deathbed.
So if even the man who sought to legally contain and commercially exploit the prophet's story was potentially changed by the power of Nat's conviction.
Right. And we know Nat's death failed to silence his legacy. So how should we approach the task of historical interpretation when the power of faith seems to transcend human political, legal, and commercial frameworks? It's a challenging question to leave you with.
We hope you found this comprehensive exploration of Nat Turner, Black Prophet, a visionary history insightful and compelling. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and tell others about this podcast. We also encourage you to suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear covered in future episodes. Thank you for subscribing and for listening.
5 seconds of silence.